Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to day 2 Apparel Textile Sourcing Virtual 2021. This is our second edition of the year. We're going to go ahead and kick off the seminar series for the day with a very exciting panel. As everyone knows, I hope, or if you're new to ATS, we do and enjoy tackling the most top of mind issues, and sustainability has always been a big one. The apparel industry. Today, our panel is going to be diving deep into the subject of climate change. So I'd like to introduce, first of all, the panel title is the apparel and textile industry doing enough to tackle climate change? A very, very important question to be asking. So I'd like to introduce our panel and then we'll get started. And I'd like to remind everybody that we do have a segment for Q&A at the very end. So if anybody has any questions, please go ahead and include them in the Q&A section here on Zoom. If you're watching on Facebook Live, please feel free to ask questions there, and our administrator will be feeding us the questions at the end of the session. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panelists. First up, we have Jennifer Gasque Crumpler. She is the Fiber Development Manager at Basf. Welcome, Jennifer. Next, we have Mike Simko. He's the Global Marketing Director for Hyosung. Did I say that right, Mike?
Hyosung.
Yeah, I'm also here to butcher names.
Think like Samsung, right? Same.
There we go. All right, next, Isabella Todaro, Head of Carbon Measurement at Climate Neutral, and Laura Husband, Managing Director at Textile. She will be asking the questions and moderating the panel internally. Welcome, everybody. Again, please hold Q&A until the very end. Without further ado, I'll be stepping out here to give room for the panel. So welcome.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Jason, and thank you so much to Apparel Textile Sourcing for inviting me to host this panel with 3 incredible speakers, which I'm sure you'll all agree. Just to get us going, maybe we can go through each member of the panel and you can each tell us a little bit briefly about how your role relates to sustainability within the apparel industry. And I'll kick off with Mike, who's promised that he won't talk for longer than 10 minutes on this. But Mike, do you want to tell us a little bit about your role and how it relates to sustainability within our sector?
So first off, Hyosung, we're a fiber supplier. So we sell filament yarn to mills that make fabric. With our Crumpler brand, we're the largest spandex producer in the world. So we represent about 1/3 of the spandex capacity. We also produce nylon and polyester filament yarns. So we've got 13 production facilities in 6 countries. We have sales and marketing offices in 40 countries. And in my role as Global Brand Marketing Director, what we do, my team specifically, we call on the value chain, the brands, the retailers, the garment producers. So we have a whole group of salespeople that do, the actual selling. But what we do is we try to manage that value chain. And clearly, with sustainability being such an important topic, we're continually working with key brands and retailers around the world and working with our own resources internally to provide those textile solutions. And we'll get into more details about what those are and how we're going to help climate change.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, Mike. It's a pleasure to have you on the panel with us today. And we've also graced with the pleasure of having Jennifer with us as well. Hello there, Jennifer.
Laura, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. We did a little podcast a little while ago, didn't we? So I know you do the Modern Cotton Story podcast for BASF.
Yes.
But maybe you could just tell us a little bit about your role in general at BASF and then how it relates to sustainability.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, thanks, Laura, for being on the podcast and having me here today. So my role at BASF, so BASF is a global company with many different divisions. And one of those divisions is our agriculture division. So in my role, I actually work with our production growers, so our farmers here in the US, and we work with them to capture all the data and sustainability metrics around the cotton that they're growing. So we map out the fields, we capture input sustainability metrics on 8 different categories. We actually then capture the bale ID and bale information so we can provide a truly traceable, cotton supply chain. I work downstream with cotton merchants. with different textile mills, with different brands and others. As you know, we all see sustainability and traceability is even more important this day and time. So we actually work very closely with our downstream partners to be able to kind of break the silos, help provide some education on, you know, production practices, where the cotton and materials that they're using, where it's coming from. Then also, you know, a big thing we do is we provide data, which we have found was really lacking in some places. So we work really hard to provide good data, you know, honest data, and that can be used through the supply chain and then tracked back with a true proven traceability component to it.
That's fantastic, Jennifer. Thank you so much for sharing with us what you do on a day-to-day basis, which is a lot, as we can hear from what you've just said there. Yeah. And finally, but by no means least, we've got Isabella with us as well. So maybe you can just tell us briefly a little bit about how your role is relating to sustainability, Isabella.
Sure thing. So I work for a climate tech nonprofit. It's called Climate Neutral. And we certify brands that have achieved zero net carbon emissions. And so to do that, we work with brands to measure the entirety of their corporate carbon inventory, and then to offset that footprint and commit to reduction plans. I focus on the measurement step in that process. So I help companies to quantify the climate impact that they're making. And we have a piece of software that we've developed to do that. And so I mostly work with brands that are downstream. And so the kind of data sharing that Jennifer just explained is like so important to our work. And I'm really happy to be here. Thank you.
Oh, amazing. Well, as everyone can tell, all three of you are the perfect ones to be talking to us about COP26 and the effects of climate change on the apparel sector. And I'm sure everyone tuning in is eager to know each of your opinions on whether or not the wider apparel sector is doing enough to tackle climate change. So who wants to get going with answering that question first? What are your opinions?
Well, I'll jump in because I'm probably the newest to the sector. So I spent 18 years of my career in the agriculture sector. So I've spent my entire career working with farmers, you know, on their input practices and input things. And just in end of 2019, I kind of moved into this role, and I was really, you know, I was really astounded at the, you know, how everybody kind of worked in silos. Everybody does really good at what they're good at, but they don't do a really good job of understanding, you know, the whole piece of it. And so for me, you know, I think it's in the sector, I've learned that I think there's a lot of willing and wanting to do better and understand. But I think that for so long it's been you kind of that lack of, okay, where do we get the information? How do we get it? You know, is it, what can we share? What can we not? And so for me moving into it, it's, I think that, you know, the willingness and the want to change and want to learn, want to understand. Of course, we know it's been amplified in the past year and a half or so, but I think that it's been great to see everyone in the supply chain wanting to do better and wanting and really kind of putting that effort, energy, and the people in place to do it and to understand how it all really at the end of the day is the whole, you know, affects every sector from the input production, whether on cotton is the farmers, all the way through that supply chain. So.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you, Jennifer. And Mike, what's your opinion on whether or not the wider apparel sector is doing enough to tackle climate change?
I tend to be the optimist, and I think we're actually doing a pretty good job. But of course, we could obviously do a lot more. What I like to think about is kind of how we as a textile business approached other major issues like child labor, labor conditions, restricted chemicals, that sort of thing. And what really is helping drive success in those areas is really the whole transparency, consumers and major brands taking a stance, publicizing it and promoting it. And I think that model is going to be similar to how we're going to tackle climate change. So having people, you know, and it's very clear now, people are making brands and retailers making very public statements about what their objectives are. And then we as suppliers to them can now develop solutions to help them meet that. And, you know, obviously carbon is a big issue, energy, water. And so there will be multiple solutions in the textile framework to address all of these issues.
Definitely. And obviously, Isabella, you work at Climate Neutral, you're working on this stuff day in, day out. So you must see from a wider point of view as well, whether or not the apparel sector is doing enough. What are your thoughts on it?
I guess my thoughts are that no. And then I think absolutely what Mike and Jennifer said about kind of like increased attention is extremely important. And a lot of the statements and commitments that are made are critical. Like that is certainly the first step. We see a lot of climate commitments that are 10 years, 20 years in the future. And I don't think that's enough. I think, you know, signatories to the UN Fashion Industry Charter for Climate Action have agreed to a 30% reduction by 2030, which is great. But I think that companies need to start communicating more clearly about what they're going to do to get to that target by 2030. And what Climate Neutral proposes is that go climate neutral in the short term. So do it this year. And the way we work with companies to do that is to understand the total climate footprint of a brand and then invest in carbon offsets, which are a mechanism to draw down or avoid carbon emissions right now. And we think that's really important because it basically puts an internal price on carbon. And until you're doing that, until you actually make these choices to switch to more sustainable materials, you know, like Mike and Jennifer kind of work to develop and to promote, it's really hard to justify those decisions to your leadership unless there's like a real dollar and cents impact. So I think the long-term commitments are great, and I think the attention is great. But I absolutely think that companies should be doing more in the short term to communicate more clearly about their plan to get there.
That's a great point, Isabella. And I'd love to get Mike and Jennifer's thoughts on that, on the basis of Hyosung and BASF on these kind of 10, 20, 30-year plans versus, you know, what's happening today as opposed to the long-term promises. What are your thoughts on Isabella's point there?
Well, did a little research on COP26, so trying to make sure I know what I'm talking about. But I think when you look at some of the traditional routes to eliminating or reducing carbon, reducing coal, electric vehicles, you know, all of those types of things, it's kind of the go-tos that we do. I think the textile business has an opportunity to look at other things as well. So as a synthetic fiber producer, we recently did a life cycle assessment on our Crumpler regen spandex. So this is a recycled spandex. If you take this waste and make first grade spandex out of it, as opposed to doing virgin, you actually reduce your carbon footprint by 2/3, so 67%. And this could be done tomorrow, okay? So I think when we look at the textile business, the use of different materials, whether it's bio-based or recycled, can make a huge and short-term impact, okay? Simple things like extending the life of garments. If your garments last twice as long, guess what? You cut your carbon footprint by 50%. Those could be done like next month. And then, you know, maybe a little longer term, you know, working to get separations technology so that garments can be separated, nylon taking away from the spandex and then reusing those materials. So, you know, for people to squeeze more out of energy savings and putting in more windmills and stuff like that, that's great and done. But I think the textile business really has some good short-term opportunities.
Yeah, and I think for me, I would agree, but you know, Isabella made a great point. I think these long-term goals and commitments are great, but the thing I've seen that once, you know, I've been in that coming into this has been, okay, well, where's the data? How are you measuring what you're doing now to say that you're going to get there? And that's one thing that we're really, really big on. especially with our E3 program. So we do measure our data. We capture data. This past year, we had, over 1 million bales of cotton or more that we capture data on. We can tell you every field it came from. We can tell you, the carbon behind that. We can tell you the production practices. We can tell you that data. We can tell you, every bit where every bale of cotton came from, every field it was mapped out on. We can tell you the amount of water that was used, if it was irrigated, not irrigated. And so I do agree. I think that there's a lot more that can be done, but I think that, right now there's long-term commitments, which are great, but it kind of comes and puts into practice. All right, well, what are we going to do? What are we doing now? What are we changing about our practices? What are we changing about our sourcing practices, our production practices to get there? And how are we measuring it? How are we going to measure it? And that's where I think that some of it's definitely lacking. And you hit on a great point, Isabella, is okay, that's great. And it does have to make a business sense. There's 3 pillars to sustainability. The environment is a huge part of it, but the economics is behind it too. So it has to make a business sense for, to do it long term. Mike had some great points. Is the fast fashion kind of movement moving away, and are we getting into more of those sustainable choices or more longer term choices or other things? And I think those business decisions are critical right now in the industry, and for businesses to decide, okay, are we going to be in a sustainable long-term business or are we not? And so I think that's kind of where we're at right now.
Yeah.
It's a great point, Jennifer. And I guess it'd be interesting to see from all of you, what do you feel are the biggest challenges and issues that are facing the sector right now and prohibiting improvements in terms of sustainability and climate change? Isabella, maybe that might be a good one for you to start with.
Yeah, I mean, Jennifer has made this point so well. But I guess I'll remake it and just from a different perspective. We work with companies all the time who have good intentions. They're coming to us to go through the process to become certified and to do the work. But they have so little visibility into their supply chain that it makes it quite hard. And we have built a method for footprinting that kind of can be flexible to different levels of data, because we want people to move on with their climate action, even if they can't accomplish, a perfect measurement the first time. But if we're going to really fix this, if we're going to actually change the way that our stuff is made, way back through the whole value chain, we need to know what's happening, and it should be a part of the standard buying practice for these brands when they're deciding on a new material supplier or contracting with a new contract manufacturer. Make it clear, put it in the terms that you're going to need some data, because it's way too late for us to not know what our carbon footprints are. I mean, it's 2021. This was supposed to be the decade of action. Measurement should be we should be spending almost no time on it at this point. We have to get past it, because knowing your carbon footprint is critical, but it's not drawing down carbon. It's just the first step. So yeah, I think clearing this hurdle for measurement, which people just get stuck at. They want to do good, and then they're oh, this is way too much. It's going to take us years just to measure. And they might have budget and will and all the things. But unless, we make it easier to measure, and that's with better tools, which is I think what we're working on. And then also just better data and more traceability. And that sounds like it's a big focus of Jennifer's work. So yeah, I think that's one of the biggest hurdles right now.
Yeah, and that's one of the things we saw too. And that's one of the things we've actually implemented. So we, for that traceability point, when we have customers come to us and say, hey, they work with we don't buy, sell trade cotton. We just work with our growers. So we have to work with everyone in the supply chain. We say, okay, well, what are the bells? What are those ID numbers? We don't do credits. We're not a credit system. We're like, nope, you have to tell us individual bells because that's the only way it's going to work. And then from that, we issue certificate of verification if those are in our systems and those are our bells. And then we actually started, and now we do give our partners a purchasing impact report. And in that report, it gives them data points about their purchase, as far as the water usage, where the states that it came from, if they want maps or, stuff, we provide that. We provide a lot of information. And I think you're right. And that's one thing I think that it's really been interesting to me. And we're still getting through that hurdle is because I do work with so many in the supply chain that everybody's kind of siloed, and we work really a lot with cotton. And it's funny when you think about cotton, there's probably 15 or 20 people who touch cotton from the time it starts to the time it gets to be a garment or a home good. And everybody looks at it differently. Everybody has a different vocabulary, a different measurement of what's good or bad. And so I think that, like you were saying, Isabella, it's okay, how do, just getting everybody to communicate and getting through that supply chain to figure out what we're really doing and that impact is happening along the way.
Do you have anything to add to that, Mike?
Well, I mean, so if you talk about challenges, I mean, you can't address any challenges without looking at the whole COVID issue. And so clearly that's caused a lot of problems. Supply chains are messed up, raw materials. I mean, there are garments not being made because there's not enough zippers. I mean, it's like the chip issue for automotive. But it's not all negative. So on the positive side, several of our key brands and retailers basically took a step back because they were working from home and did deep dives and looked at their policies and their objectives and their goals. Now, as Isabella says, that's only the first step, but now they at least have something that they could measure against. They could challenge people like Hyosung and say, hey, what's most important to us is landfills. So what can you do for us to help us resolve that issue? Or the most important thing for us is carbon. So what can you do? So it's taking the conversation into a much more mature, sophisticated mode. And so I think that's going to help things. On the downside, again, we're still working remotely. And I really think that's going to impact, although we did well, it's impacting innovation, it's impacting collaboration. And so the more we could get back to some form of normalcy and see each other and bounce ideas off of each other, I think that'll be something that needs to happen.
Fantastic points then.
Oh, sorry, I'm just very quickly going to add to just the certainty of like normal times can help your sustainability and climate planning so much. Like demand planning was super hard because like who knows what people want to buy in an unprecedented time. And so I saw footprint spike, especially, which we haven't talked so much about yet, but in like the shipping category. And it's because we had no idea what to expect and people were like air freighting things. And so, yeah, I agree. It'll be good to get back to normal times so that we can kind of like double down on climate as the pressing global issue that it is when we don't have another pressing global issue.
I was going to say, what's going to be normal? I thought that's going to be interesting. What's going to be the new normal?
We need a crystal ball for that one, don't we? Oh, but Isabella, you did touch on shipping there, and I think it's important, isn't it, to talk about some of the kind of the buzzwords that are kind of moving around the apparel industry at the moment and how they do relate to climate change and obviously upcoming COP26. So maybe we could talk a little bit about how shipping is going to be affected by trying to tackle climate change and waste elimination, the new retail models such as rental and circularity. There's all these buzzwords kind of flying around at the moment, isn't there? It's what, if any of them, do you feel is the solution to this?
Yeah, all and everything. But yeah, so we follow the greenhouse gas protocol to measure carbon footprints. It's the accounting language for this stuff, and it kind of buckets carbon emissions. And so when we look at footprints, we're looking at the footprint from cradle to customer. End of life and use phase is super important as well, but that's kind of our scope for certification. within that scope, we see a couple of categories driving the footprint in a totally disproportionate way. So that's materials themselves, the manufacturing emissions it takes to kind of cut and sew materials into a product, and then shipping. And so addressing any of the three of those are going to impact your footprint way, way more than like putting solar panels on your office, which is great, but a super small percentage of your total carbon footprint. And yeah, I mean, there are a million things you could do within those three buckets, and materials are all the carbon embedded in the product when it comes to you. So that's what kind of, so that's what Mike is touching on when he talks about a 2/3 reduction in spandex footprint. So that would come into one of our brands already way lower than the kind of counterfactual. And so that would be a huge reduction in their purchased goods and services footprint or their material footprint. Same with a more sustainably grown cotton. You know, if you're engaging with more sustainable farming practices, there are less fertilizer inputs, and that will lower your materials footprint as well. Once you've cut and sewn your product, then you cut and sew your product, and that takes like more energy to kind of turn it into a product. That means that you need to be looking at the energy sources at your usually contract manufacturer if you're a brand. If you're a manufacturer, obviously it's your own kind of manufacturing footprint, but what can you do to decarbonize manufacturing facilities? So can they run on clean power? Can you purchase renewable energy credits, which stimulate like the growth of renewables in the markets where you work? And then lastly, yeah, this shipping footprint, produce way closer to your end customer, and then you're already doing so much. Like that's the number one thing. Second, and this is so easy because it's also cheaper, like this saves you money too, but just eliminate air freight whenever you can. And then, you know, just be efficient. And that's something that like everyone should be pushing towards. So I think we think climate solutions are these like far off things that, you know, we don't have the technology. And just because we haven't figured out like hydrogen power shipping doesn't mean that we can't seriously reduce our shipping footprint.
That's fantastic. I'm intrigued to see, Mike, what's working for you at Hyosung at the moment?
So there's two topics. So first on the shipping, you know, we need to look at the overall trends of on the consumer level of more online buying. And so, you know, having that Amazon delivery for one item and then it gets returned and back, and are we moving in the wrong direction, quite frankly? And surprisingly, I've not come across any information on that, but I would, you know, raise that as a serious question, and that's something short term could be addressed. As a fiber producer, and it's difficult for us because our production facilities are huge. But we do produce in 6 different countries. And what we do is we try to source our fiber as close to the need. So for example, the end of last year, 2020, we invested in our Turkish plant and our Brazilian plant because we saw demand increasing in those areas. So as opposed to expanding China or our Vietnam plant or Indian plant, we purposefully expand where we're locally supplying. And so I think that that's obviously a good thing. It's going to save transportation, saves cost, which, I mean, let's face it, sustainability, right? And obviously it's going to reduce carbon through transportation and things like that. The other piece I wanted to address, because I always hear the term waste elimination, and being a former engineer, I mean, at least in a synthetic framework, I mean, we have engineers who spend their entire career saving a penny trying to reduce waste and improve yields. There will always be waste. I mean, if you look at the cutting floor, right? The best garment producers in the world are always going to have cutting floor waste. So, you know, I'd like to, you know, we definitely need to reduce waste to the bare minimum. But then the question is, what do you do with the waste that still will be there under best practices? And so again, in the textile framework, reusing industrial waste, not just focusing on consumer waste, but industrial waste is important. And then again, when you look at garments and cutting waste, separations technologies and that sort of thing.
Great point, Mike. And it made me think as well, where do you feel consumer awareness fits into this? Because I guess they need to understand as well, don't they, that there is no such thing as complete waste elimination and that kind of thing.
Yeah, so I mean, we see the whole gamut. You know, there are several companies that are trying to take back product. You know, people like Patagonia will take it back, repair it, and then resell it or give it to somebody. I think a lot of these are just trials at this point, which is fine. We have to understand what's going to work and what's not going to work. But I think ultimately there'll be, you know, ways of design, you know, it's the whole circularity discussion. How are we designing our textiles and our garments so that they could be either recycled or reused at the end? And so we're actively working with several not-for-profits looking at how to achieve that.
Oh, that's fantastic, Mike. And Jennifer, what, in your opinion, what would you say is currently working and what could we do more of within the sector?
Yeah, so one thing that we've seen that's working, and we've seen a lot of it here, is just like Mike and Isabella mentioned, is shortening that supply chain. So we were, you know, we've had some milk, you know, here in the US, we work very closely with, and they have worked with us to be able to source their, you know, since I work really a lot in cotton, they source their cotton within 300 miles of their location or less, or 50 miles of it. You know, we've seen a lot of that's happened where we've, so I think, you know, with the shipping and logistics and everything that's happened this past year, some of them had to, you know, we've had some customers that have had to pivot a little bit and say, wait a second, all right, can we source more locally? Can we do this locally? So we've seen those, you know, that happen a lot. I think that's working. You know, you mentioned earlier about buzzwords, and that's something I've had to really kind of dive into, because there are some buzzwords that are definitely out there. And when you kind of start digging, you're asking the questions, okay, well, what does that mean? Or let's talk about it. No one can really tell me. So, you know, it's been, okay, well, let's dive into, okay, well, you know, and I just use the word regenerative. And I'm like, well, what do you mean by regenerative? And well, you know, all right, well, when we look at it from our perspective, it's crop rotation, simple or complex crop rotation. Like that's what we're doing. You know, we talk about it. And I hear the word, and it, you know, hopefully it doesn't bother anyone. I hear the word organic cotton used a lot. Well, you know, there's really not that much organic cotton in the world to feel all the labels that are on the, you know, and so it really goes into the conversation of, well, okay, let's talk about organic, you know, or, you know, GMO versus non-GMO. So, you know, having some of these, I've had to really dive in, you know, and help on the understanding kind of downstream, because we hear a lot from, you know, that, hey, well, we want organic because they're not using, you know, certain, like, well, actually, do you really? Because if you do, then you're having, you know, a larger footprint, you know, a larger carbon footprint. It's going to cost you more. It's going to do a lot of these things, because that's really what the practice is versus maybe what we think it is from a marketing perspective. You know, and a lot of the stuff we use with our farmers here in the US that'll use a GMO crop, well, that's because it's less, you know, pesticides going out. It's less trips across. It's less, it really is more sustainable. And so I think, you know, the things that are working is really asking the questions and diving in, working on helping understand. So it you know, bring the educational piece. I think that's working. A lot of it is, you know, shortening that supply chain. You know, and then I think another thing, and you asked earlier about consumer awareness. So we do a lot with that. That's a big focus for us with our program. We partner a lot here with National Teach Ag. We've done a lot of programs in the US. We partner with schools and others to help just have those conversations of, you know, kind of that farm to table was a big thing, but really, you know, we call it, you know, farm to fashion, just understanding that your choices and everything make a decision, you know, has a consequence. And so we done some outreach and some educational pieces, understanding, you know, where, you know, cotton products, you know, being biodegradable, or, you know, so it helps them with the waste, or, you know, do better. So we did a life cycle of a t-shirt learning series. So we've done that to help, you know, just consumers and others. So I think those are the things that are working. But, you know, it's I know we've all mentioned it before, is really just trying to be more transparent about what we're doing, and, you know, diving in and not just saying, okay, hey, this is a buzzword marketing, take it at face value. Let's really understand what's happening, and kind of behind the science behind some of it.
100%, Jennifer. And what I was taking a lot from what you were saying there is greenwashing, effectively, where people are taking these buzzwords and saying, we're doing this, we're doing that, but there's no substance behind it. Isabella, it would be interesting to get your point of view from climate neutral as to whether that is causing a problem in itself, people trying to use these words, but not necessarily putting the substance behind it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's certainly a problem. I'll give a more optimistic answer here. I think the fact that there's consumer demand for climate action or sustainability is really powerful. Something like 75% of Americans have expressed concern for climate change. And 70% of companies don't have climate targets. So there's this huge opportunity, right, to like mobilize consumers to demand corporate climate action. And so I think seeing that as an opportunity, rather than like a risk for greenwashing, is climate neutral's approach. And so what we've tried to do, I mean, like, God bless the consumers on this call. We're being very detailed. Most consumers don't like pay this much attention. They make a decision at the store. And what we're trying to do with our consumer label is make that really easy. So this is the product from the brand that is taking climate seriously. And then our job as a nonprofit is to build a rigorous standard. And that's our work with companies, brands, corporations, is to set a high, rigorous standard for what it means to be climate neutral. And so that's kind of our, I mean, if you think of us as like an activist organization, that's our platform. Those are our demands. And the only way that that works is if consumers care about climate and start to select for that label. Certainly greenwashing is a problem, and especially in climate. I think you probably can surmise how I feel about some of these like very long-term climate commitments. Like when a company comes out and says that they'll be climate neutral, carbon neutral by 2050, like the people making that announcement will be retired by then. So I don't know like what it's tell us what you're doing right now. And so I think that that's like the number one way that you see greenwashing happening in climate specifically is like these super long-term commitments that then you have like, it's certainly not regulated. And like no one's checking up on what you're doing to meet these targets. So it's just like you can say it and get some like positive marketing flow and then like move on. And that's the number one greenwashing thing in climate, I think. And then there are all these other things that like sound sustainable. But again, like if you do the math and like really look at them, they're not actually like, they're not climate solutions, which they might be really good things. So for example, like a lot of people want to switch to glass bottles. This is less relevant to maybe the apparel industry, but we see it a lot where they're like, we're going to get rid of plastic and we're going to switch to glass bottles. And that's great. Like I also don't like plastic. It's a petroleum product, like get rid of it. It's fine. But glass is heavy. So when you ship it around the world, like there are trade-offs. And so I think like, yeah, just having people like looking critically at a lot of these claims is really important. It's not greenwashing when you switch to glass. That's also a great thing to do. But, you know, being critical and like actually asking the like second order questions are important.
That's it. This is a fantastic discussion. So I just want to thank all three of you for it today. It's been, I'm loving it. And I hope everyone tuning in is loving it as well. And obviously this whole panel discussion has come about because there is a big international conference on climate change coming up in November, which means that, you know, on a global level, the topic of climate change is going to be covered across industries, which is fantastic. So I'd love to hear from each of you about what you hope the apparel industry will be able to achieve from the upcoming international conference in November. Who wants to go first on that one?
I kind of touched upon it in a previous answer, but I think what the apparel industry could do, which is unique, obviously our companies should be and will continue to focus on savings of energy and use of biomass and things like that. But I think what the unique opportunity we can bring to help climate change is around replacing materials with more sustainable ones. So again, the recycled materials, the bio-based materials that are coming from crops. And again, working on longevity of garments, as well as, waste reduction. And those are very real and those are very short term.
Do you want to jump in there, Jennifer?
Yeah, so I think, and I guess this is probably an elementary answer, but I think one of the biggest things is, I think we've seen it on this call, because I was laughing because Isabella was saying so many things I've said so many times. And I was thinking, man, I hope she and I never, it's great. We can team up and we can solve some of the problems here. I'm laughing because some of the things she said, I'm like, man, I've said that before. But I think one of the biggest things, for us and BASF, of course, BASF is, we're a global company. So, we have many divisions, not just our ag division. We have a performance material division that does, create and work very hard to create a very sustainable, different type of, polyester synthetic material providing, so we're very global. We have a lot of different divisions. And I think one of the biggest things that we really are looking forward to is to see all the new studies, new announcements, new things, new practices, and new best sharing practices that sometimes maybe, yes, there's a lot of good things that come out of the conference and good come out of things, but sometimes it's the side discussions and events and new things that can be adapted across the industry. That is one really, really big piece. I know we're looking forward, to seeing that piece of it. BASF we did, come out with a lot of our corporate sustainability commitments as a leader. One of those being, having 400 million hectares supported with digital technologies by 2030. And for us, we're moving very closely into that, and we're hitting that goal. Just last year in the US, we had just on our cotton side of the business and agriculture, we had close to 600,000 acres or more that we've mapped out. We have, multiple other digital platforms that we work with. So, on a global basis, that is something we're very committed to. And so I think those are some of the things, so when we talk about climate, there's many components. And so we're excited about some of our areas that we can really bring and focus in on, whether it's digital or what other components that can come into it as well.
And a point you made there, which I found fascinating there, Jennifer, you spoke about the side conversations that COP26 could lead to. And I'd love to get your thoughts from all of you about how you feel industry collaboration within the apparel industry, but also cross-industry collaboration. And from outside, obviously, Isabella, you work across different industries as well, how that can help to benefit, improve the effects of climate change within the apparel industry moving forward.
Yeah, it's such a wonderful question. Everybody produces at shared factories. So brands produce in shared factories. So if, you have one metal cup and the other metal cup, the different brands very likely could have been produced in the same factory. It's the same for the apparel industry. And so coming together pre-competition and going to your contract manufacturers to ask for better data, to push for decarbonization in the manufacturing facilities, install solar panels, switch to hydropower, whatever it is. That kind of coalition building is really important. And that's a critical outcome of COP26. COP is a conference for nations, and there's a really interesting interplay between national footprints and corporate footprints. And so the way we account for this stuff matters. And I think a lot of the consuming nations they don't count the footprint of the goods consumed in their countries. And then there's no specific outcome that I'm looking for here. I'm just looking for like more responsibility from companies. And so that means kind of like bulking up the fashion industry charter, putting in more like interim goals. And then I also think, nations will be talking about carbon credit trading schemes, Article 6. I'd like to see companies get more involved in that, because this is an industry that will not reduce to zero by 2050. It's impossible, I think, with the technology that we have and that I think we'll have for the next 30 years to get to true zero through reductions alone. So we have to start thinking about like how these multinational corporations that have footprints bigger than most countries in the world operate in like carbon credit trading programs as well.
That's fascinating, Isabella. And obviously you touched on the fact that COP26, it isn't a global international conference that looks at nations as a whole. What do each of you think about the effects of legislation and whether or not legislation is the answer to solving the issues around sustainability with the apparel, within the apparel sector? Do you think we need to sort of be told, no, this is what you have to do? Or do you think the industry can sort of sort it out on its own?
I'm not a big legislation guy. I'm more market forces kind of a thing. And if it could be set up properly, I think it can work very well. I gave the examples of Western brands and retailers in Europe and the US working on child labor and restricted chemicals. I think the thing we need to also think about when you talk about legislation, it tends to be country specific and it's sometimes impractical to roll it out globally. Most of this conversation we're having today involves Western brands. So there's a huge trend for Western brands to lose out for Chinese brands because there's a huge China for China movement. And there's no discussion going on right now, or very little in China, about what are we doing about carbon? What are we doing about the environment? So that's a big factor that needs to be addressed.
That's a great point, Mike. And I know we have quite a big Chinese audience at the show, so I'm hoping we'll get some questions from some of the Chinese visitors to the show today near the end of this session. Did you have anything to add to that, Jennifer?
Yeah, I just think Mike, he hit the nail on the head because it is a global sector, and every country is different. I think we see in the US in some places, there are some bans, there's some bans on certain supply chains, certain things. And I don't know if legislation is an answer, but I think we have to look back historically. We haven't had it and look where we're at today. We all want to hope that, and we all in our mind think we want to do inherently what's good. But, we don't have a consequence for not, or there hasn't been a consequence leading up to the fact of until some of these things came out in the open. And then now we understand that there's, we don't want to have these issues, and whether it's social issues, forced labor, but have we seen actions change? And in the sense of, have we seen business practices, whether it's brand apparel, others in this space, have we seen their sourcing, have we seen their practices, business practices change, or have we just seen a actual marketing or compelling story coming out to say, oh yes, we're against it, but have it really changed? And I think that's kind of where we're at. And it is, you're right, like how do we on a global level, every country is going to be different, specific on everything. But I think it's got to be until consumers at the end of the day say, you know what, no, I'm just not. Like I want to see, we are a digital company. I mean, we've got our cell phones. We're all over the world having this meeting. We like instantaneous information at our hand and our fingertips. And I think consumers are going to drive this. I'm working with a brand now, and we're working very closely to have that transparent supply chain on their garments where you can scan the QR code and it'll bring up, hey, this is the field and this is where it came from and the information and that piece of it. And I think that consumers are driving that. But, you know, from a legislative space, I mean, until we can get all agree globally, but who enforces that? You know, I think that's going to be where we have to figure it out. So no one's at a disadvantage compared to, you know, depending on where they're at.
It's a very great point there, Jennifer. And as well, it'd be great to hear from Isabella in terms of whether or not, I mean, we're talking about everything on a global level and the challenges of things being on a global level, and then obviously the apparel industry versus other industries. Isabella, I'll ask you this first, but obviously I'd love to hear Mike and Jennifer's opinions on it as well. Have you seen any good examples of sustainable advancements in certain nations, across industries? Do you have any examples where things have worked that the apparel industry could maybe take on board?
Yeah, this is a great question. I was kind of thinking on the legislation question too, and I'll give maybe a blended answer, but international agreements don't mean legislation. They're just an agreement that you'll go out and legislate. And legislation doesn't mean regulation. It could mean you can legislate in a lot of ways to meet these goals. And so government investment is super important. So tax credits for doing things the right way, like basic R&D spending to, you know, address some of these like gaps in technology that we have in the apparel industry, in the shipping space. All of that is super important. And I think it's absolutely the role of government. And I think that countries where we've seen historical investment, like where it's been prioritized, we see more progress on climate. So Europe is easily always like 5 to 10 years ahead of us on climate. And yeah, I don't know if it's chicken and egg, because I do think consumers in Europe are more concerned with these things as well. So I don't know if it's top down change or bottom up change, but I think what works is like certainly putting this in the mainstream. So having an educated body of consumers who can demand something simple, and then making the solutions affordable. And I do think that government is a big part of that. But yeah, I mean, specific solutions, there are a million things, right? It's just like, it's working where people are investing, like where people are spending the money. So, you know, material sustainability, all this stuff we talked about as solutions, like you have to do all of it, and it requires investment, and both within the supply chain to make changes. And then climate neutral also requires investment outside of the supply chain in the form of carbon credits to compensate for the footprint that you do produce. That's also really important. Again, we're not going to reduce to zero right now. And there are climate solutions that are out there and they need financing, and you can invest in them today. And that's all that a carbon credit does, is drive climate finance to projects that need it. So I think like places that spend money are doing better. And that might be like a simplistic answer.
Oh, fantastic, Isabella. And actually, just to go back to what Mike was saying earlier about China and the issues around sustainability in China, we did have a live comment come in from someone saying the young consumers in China are very concerned around the climate change issues. So that's got to be a positive thing moving forwards for the whole world, basically. So thank you for sharing that comment with us. The time is flying by, and I'm sure Jason wants to share questions that we've had from the audience. So are there any thoughts or comments that you'd like to share with us before we wrap up today that we haven't been able to touch on during this very broad-ranging discussion and fascinating discussion? Just want to give you the opportunity to share any final words or thoughts before we move over to questions.
No, I just like to say, Laura, I think this is a perfect step in the right direction, and thank you for pulling you and the team pulling this panel together, because I think this is a good example of the beginning step to getting a transparent supply chain. You've got with, Mike and his spot and what their company does in the supply chain, Isabella and her work and that they do, our work we do with E3 and providing kind of that input data on raw materials and other things. So I think this to me is kind of that first step. And we've seen some of this start happening that I think is going to be, got to be where we move forward, is having the conversations and having a diverse group, having the panel and having everyone in that supply chain together.
Definitely. Did you want to add to that, Mike?
Well, I just wanted to go off of what Isabella was saying about the carbon counting and all that sort of thing. I think if you look at like the auto industry, they have done a nice blend of starting with getting miles per hour up. I'm sorry, getting miles per gallon up, then moving into hybrid solutions, and now moving into electric vehicles. So that type of approach is something that we really gravitate to. Let's use the best available technologies and work on the future ones. But let's take the winners while we can and implement those.
That's fantastic, fantastic point there, Mike. And how about for you, Isabella?
No, this has been such a good conversation. Thank you for having me.
Oh, brilliant. And actually, I'm very thrilled to say we've got the incredible Bob Antashak who's tuning in. He's tuning in live. He writes a column for Textile, juststyle.com. Do check that out if you haven't before, and you can register for free. And he also co-hosts the podcast that Jennifer does each week, doesn't he? So
yeah,
a real industry favourite. So thank you, Bob, for tuning in. But he shared a question with us, so I'll give that to the panel. So he's asked, do you think COP26 will be able to develop a common definition of sustainability? And that's a fantastic question. Thank you, Bob, for sharing it with us. He wants to go for that. So do you think COP26 will be able to develop a common definition of sustainability? Tough question.
Yeah, I think it'll be, I don't know if they'll be able to define a clear definition, because I think if we were to ask us four on the call, we all have a different definition, so I don't know if it'll have a clear definition, but I think that the good thing about data and capturing and having concrete information is that you can provide a wider range of answers to definition. You can provide a wide range of solutions. So, where some, depending on where in the world you're at, if you're, water may be an issue, or food or hunger, or other things. So I think, that plays a big part of it. But I think, if somehow in that definition of sustainability, transparency can be included, and, some of those things, I think that'll kind of lead to a more level ground, level setting of how, a definition that a broader audience maybe could get. So the answer is really a talk around, because I don't know if they will or not.
Mike or Isabella, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think sustainability is, well, sustainability means so many different things. I'm not sure that it's our most helpful tool from a language perspective. We have sustainable development, and that's defined. We have financial sustainability, we have environmental sustainability. I think the goal of COP needs to be let's not talk in squishy language at all. We want numbers on the board. We want to see so countries come with their own plan for reductions, and when they use words like sustainability, I think I get wary, because I want to see specific percentage point reductions from a specific baseline year, and I want to know what industry those are going to be in, and then again show us all the receipts and let us know how you're going to get there. So I think for textile and apparel, sustainability becomes a marketing tool, and for that reason we need to be specific about it. I'm not totally sure that's the role of the Conference of the Parties. I want to see specific like climate goals come out of this conference. And I think that then it's the job of the industry to take those specific targets and translate them into your business. And then that's sustainable. So we take our, I think, marching orders from these global conferences, which are informed, of course, by the IPCC reports, like the one that just came out. That's why it comes out ahead of this conference. So yeah, I don't know if that's helpful.
That's fantastic, Isabella. So the numbers, rather than a definition on sustainability, you are excited to see how the numbers are interpreted and how we can make sure we improve on them moving forwards.
That's right. And get more rigorous every year. We're learning that things are happening faster than we thought they would. So like, let's adapt to the latest science too. We have to get more rigorous every time.
And as a journalist and an editor, I know you can kind of do whatever you want with words, but numbers are numbers, aren't they? You can, you know where you stand with them. So that's a great point. Mike, did you have anything to add to that one?
Well, as a former engineer, my engineering brain kicks in, and I agree wholeheartedly with Isabella. I mean, so as opposed to using mushy words, what's the objective? What are we trying to accomplish? What are the different alternatives we could put forth to try to solve that or achieve that goal? And then let's implement a plan. So at the end of the day, yeah, there's going to be words, but let's put some numbers and some actions together.
I think that's a great way to finish off. That's fantastic. Thank you so much to all of you for being on this panel discussion with us today. And thank you to the show for inviting us all to be on it as well. And I'll let Jason kick off with any questions that might have come in during that session.
Well, actually, you guys took over my job here for the Q&A here. So that is a great question, by the way. I just wanted to say about the defining sustainability. I think there's, depending on who you ask, there's an opinion, or depending on what sector of the industry you focus on, there's sustainability means a variety of things, and it's important for all of our viewers to understand the differences between the different types. Climate change is certainly one aspect of sustainability that the apparel industry plays a very big part in, but there's also financial sustainability, longevity of your company on a timeline, fair labor, all these other issues. So it's very important. That's why we love having these panels come on. So thank you to all of you for putting your 2 cents in. It's very interesting hearing the different perspectives from the different backgrounds that y'all have. And it's exciting to see how things are finally starting to gain momentum, as you've all shared today. So more in the future, and I'm very excited to see how leaders like this continue to lead the way in terms of encouraging sustainability and a more sustainable future for the apparel industry for all of us. I would like to just make a couple announcements here. So if everybody would like to go ahead after the panel here to visit our virtual landing page, this is essentially the show floor, the virtual show floor as it is. Our next session will be the effects of the pandemic for industry narratives. This will start at 10:30 Pacific Eastern Standard Time in just about under 30 minutes. Again, in the meantime, I encourage everybody to visit the virtual landing page I just posted in the chat, the link there. This is where you'll find over 100 exhibiting manufacturers of the show. Also, you'll have our show office in there. In there, you'll find matchmaking. It's a live hangout where you can network with suppliers, other attendees, and our speakers as well will be coming in and out of there from this seminar series. Also, be sure to check out our 3 exhibition rooms. Room 3 featuring our China suppliers, room 2 featuring our suppliers from India, and then room 1 featuring suppliers from the United States, Canada, Portugal, Mongolia, Bangladesh, and Brazil. Also, if anybody would like to rewatch this panel or any others in the future, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. I've gone ahead and included the link there as well. As soon as those videos are available, generally within a week or 2 of the show concluding, they will be posted there. So again, thank you all so much for joining us today, and look forward to reconnecting with you in the future.
So much.
Thank you very much.
Take care, guys.
Bye.